Policies and issues. Mexican government and politics has changed dramatically since the 1980s. Today, Mexico has taken serious steps towards becoming a democracy, but the economy that had shown signs of improvement since the collapse of 1982 took a nosedive after the global economic crisis in 2008. The country is trying to move from regional vulnerability to global reliability, but those connections to other parts of the world made the Mexican economy responsive to the contraction of the U.S. economy. Stubborn problems remain, both economic and political. PRI has been entangled with the government so long that creating branches that operate independently is a huge task. The gap between the rich and the poor is still wide in Mexico, despite the growth of the middle class in the north. President Peña Nieto faces a big challenge in shaping Mexico's relationship with the United States and in controlling violence associated with the drug trade. How does Mexico retain the benefits of trade and cooperation with its neighbor to the north, and yet steer its own independent course? The economy. Mexico's economic development has had a significant impact on social conditions in the country. Overall, despite the economic downturn of 2008, the standard of living has improved greatly since the 1940s. Rates of infant mortality, literacy, and life expectancy have steadily improved. Health and education services have expanded, despite severe cutbacks after the economic crisis of 1982 and again in 2008. The Mexican Miracle. Between 1940 and 1960, Mexico's economy grew as a whole by more than 6% a year. Industrial production rose even faster, averaging nearly 9% for most of the 1960s. Agriculture's share of total production dropped from 25% to 11%, while that of manufacturing rose from 25% to 34%. All this growth occurred without much of the inflation that had plagued many other Latin American economies, but it meant that large numbers of people have moved from rural to urban areas, creating new urban issues. Problems. A growing gap between the rich and the poor was a major consequence of rapid economic growth. Relatively little attention was paid to the issues of equality and social justice that historically has led to revolutions in the first place. Social services programs were limited at best. From 1940 to 1980, Mexico's income distribution was among the most unequal of all the LDCs, with the bottom 40% of the population never earning more than 11% of total wages. Today, inequality is lessened slightly, but it is still an important issue. Rapid and unplanned urbanization accompanied the growth. In recent years, millions have migrated to cities, and as a result, the Federal District, Guadalajara, and other major cities became urban nightmares, with many people living in huge shantytowns with no electricity, running water, or sewers. Poor highway planning with no mass transit means that traffic congestion is among the worst in the world. Pollution from cars and factories make Mexico City's air so dirty that it is unsafe to breathe. The crisis. In its effort to industrialize, the Mexican government borrowed heavily against expectations that oil prices would remain high forever. Much of the rapid growth was based on oil, especially since Mexico's production began increasing just as that of OPEC countries was decreasing during the early 1970s. When the price of oil plummeted in 1982, so did Mexico's economy. By 1987, Mexico's debt was over $107 billion, making it one of the most heavily indebted countries in the world. The debt represented 70% of Mexico's entire GNP. Reform. President Miguel de la Madrid began his sexenio in 1982 with all of these economic problems before him. He began a dramatic reform program that reflected the values of the new Technico leaders. This program continued through the presidencies of Salinas and Zedillo and brought about one of the most dramatic economic turnarounds in modern history. Sharp cuts in government spending. According to agreements with the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the U.S. government, and private banks, Mexico began austerity plans that greatly reduced government spending. Hundreds of thousands of jobs were cut, subsidies to government agencies were slashed, and hundreds of public enterprises were eliminated. Debt reduction. Debt still continues to plague Mexico, although the U.S. spearheaded a multinational plan to reduce interest rates on loans and allow more generous terms for their repayment. Mexico still pays an average of about $10 billion a year in interest payments. Privatization. In order to allow market forces to drive the Mexican economy, Madrid's government decides to give up much of its economic power. Most importantly, the government privatized many public enterprises, especially those that were costing public money. President Salinas returned the banks to the private sector in 1990. By the late 1980s, a mini Silicon Valley was emerging in Guadalajara, where IBM, Hewlett-Packard, Wang, and other tech firms set up factories and headquarters. Special laws like duty-free importing of components and cheap labor encourage U.S. companies to invest in Mexican plants. Today, Mexico's economy has diversified significantly and is not as dependent on oil production. Still, the problems persist today, particularly those of income inequality, urban planning, and pollution. As a businessman, Vicente Fox made a campaign promise to oversee 7% annual growth in the Mexican economy during his sexenio, but his hopes fell short. Between 2001 and 2003, Mexico's economic slowdown can be partially explained by the U.S. recession after the September 11 attacks. In 2004, the economy grew by 4.1%, but an estimated 40% of the Mexican population was still below the poverty line, despite some new initiatives by the government to provide benefits and pensions for those not covered by jobs in the formal economy. Energy reform and the economic crisis of 2008. When Felipe Calderón became president in 2006, oil production in Mexico was falling off, largely because little exploration for new oil fields had taken place for decades. Pemex was a large, inefficient parastatal that provided almost 40% of the budget, but its technical capabilities had atrophied. President Fox had tried to privatize Pemex but had met with too much resistance, so Calderón tried another approach. In early 2008, he announced a reform to give Pemex greater budgetary autonomy and strengthen government regulations on the oil industry. However, his plan also enabled private contracting of refining and would allow Pemex to hire private contractors for the distribution and storage of refined products. The reform included a large bond issue to raise money for 2 new refineries. His plan met opposition in the legislature, especially from PRD, whose leaders accused Calderón of privatizing Pemex. However, the president's plans were foiled by an even deeper problem, the effects of the global economic crisis of 2008. By early 2009, the Mexican economy was shrinking quickly, with experts estimating that the rate of 5.9% reduction during the first quarter of 2009, 4 times the predicted fall in Latin America as a whole. The main cause was the nation's close integration with the United States. Since exports across the Rio Grande River are equivalent to the fifth of Mexico's GDP, these exports fell by 36% in 2008 as demand from the U.S. dried up. U.S. investors also froze their operations in Mexico as they tried to resuscitate their businesses at home, which in turn caused a depreciation of the Mexican peso. The recent explosive growth of Brazil has led to Inter-American Development Bank, the biggest lender in the region, to describe a 2-speed Latin America, in which economies, such as Mexico, which do most of their trade with developed countries, lag behind those, such as Brazil, that have forged links with emerging markets. Whereas Brazil sent 16% of its exports in 2009 to fellow BRICS, Russia, India, and China, only 3% of Mexico's exports went to the BRICS. Once again, Mexico has found that events in the north dictate the country's economic development, keeping it from charting the independent course so necessary for its prosperity. During the 2012 election campaign, Enrique Peña Nieto promised to reform Pemex, not to privatize it, but to allow joint ventures with private firms. PRD has vowed to keep Pemex's monopoly intact, and Obrador prepared to take his populist battle against energy reform to the streets. In recent years, Pemex has been plagued by deficits and 2 explosions in 2013, one of which claimed 37 lives. In late 2014, the government began the process of inviting private oil companies to bid for new oil exploration blocks. The government hopes that foreign and private companies will team up with Pemex, increasing private energy investments in Mexico. Telecommunications reform. In June 2013, Peña Nieto signed into law a far-reaching reform of the telecommunications and broadcast industries that aimed to curb the market power of big companies in order to increase competition and investment in the industries. The law created a new regulatory body, IFETEL, which has the power to regulate and even force dominant players to sell assets. According to the Wall Street Journal, the company expected to be the most affected by new regulation is América Móvil, which is controlled by billionaire Carlos Slim, and has 70% of the country's wireless customers and more than 70% of the fixed phone lines. Televisa SAB, which controls close to 70% of the broadcast television market, and TV Azteca SAB, which has around 30%, face competition from 2 new planned digital networks.